Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to unpack the fascinating century-long lifespan of one of democratic Europe's most successful and, frankly, most ideologically complex political parties, Fianna Fáil. Whether you're a dedicated political junkie or you're just curious about how power is won, lost, and eventually clawed back, their story is an absolute masterclass in survival, populism, and the sheer art of being everything to everyone. Let's get into it. Here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with the origins of a juggernaut, then look at their catch-all ideology, the historic 2011 collapse, their rebuilding and historic coalitions, and finally, their current footprint in Northern Ireland and Europe. All right, part 1, origins of a juggernaut, from rebel offshoot to absolute political dominance. Let's see how this political powerhouse was actually born out of some really deep national divisions. So to really understand this party, we've got to travel back to the bitter, fragmented aftermath of the Irish Civil War in the 1920s. Fianna Fáil was founded in 1926 by Eamon de Valera, who is this towering, very polarizing figure in Irish history. He actually led a splinter group away from the older Sinn Féin party after a massive dispute over whether to take seats in the newly formed parliament and swear an oath to the British king. Well, de Valera decided it was time to work the system from the inside. By 1927, his new party entered the Irish Parliament, the Dáil, and incredibly, by 1932, they had built enough momentum to form their very first government. In just 6 short years, they went from being a rebel offshoot to officially holding the reins of the state. That is a wild turnaround. Even the name of the party tells you a lot. It reflects a deeply culturally nationalist identity. Fianna Fáil translates from Irish to soldiers of destiny, or warriors of Fáil. Fáil being an ancient poetic name for Ireland itself. Now, while their official legal name is Fianna Fáil, the Republican Party, their initial goal was to fully republicanize the new Irish Free State from within. To pull this off, they heavily styled themselves to appeal directly to the working class, to small rural farmers, and to the urban poor. It was a brilliant strategic move, honestly. It preempted and absorbed voters who, in most other European countries, might have naturally gravitated toward the Labour Party. Okay, wrap your head around this number, 61. Between 1932 and 2011, Fianna Fáil was in power for 61 out of 79 years. Think about that for a second. That level of democratic dominance is almost unparalleled in modern Western Europe. Throughout those decades, every single one of their party leaders served as Taoiseach, Ireland's prime minister. They were the absolute center of gravity for the country. They guided Ireland through strict World War II neutrality under de Valera, through massive economic modernization under later leaders like Sean Lemmis, right straight into the booming wealth of the Celtic Tiger era. They didn't just govern the state. For a very long time, they functionally were the state. Moving to part 2, the catch-all ideology, defining the undefinable, broad church. Which brings us to the big question. How exactly did they maintain that dominance for so long? Well, political scientists literally give themselves headaches trying to pin this party down. If you dig into the academic literature, scholars use a dizzying array of contradictory labels to describe the exact same organization. Are they conservative, centrist, populist, national liberal, Christian democratic? The actual answer is kinda all of the above. They mastered what's known as a catch-all ideology. They basically defied the typical European left versus right political spectrum, building a super adaptable platform that somehow attracted support across totally disparate social classes. They managed to secure the votes of the wealthy business owner in Dublin and the struggling small-town farmer at the exact same time. And you know what? The party itself wholeheartedly embraces this ambiguity. Their modern leader, Michel Martin, explicitly framed them in 2023 as a progressive Republican Party that fundamentally rejects the need to conform to traditional left or right ideology. It's not an accident. It's practically a feature of their design. A highly successful former leader, Bertie Ahern, once famously summed up this broad church approach by saying the party looks out for the small-ranking guy, supports the middle-ranking guy, and simultaneously assists the big guy, all at once. If you try to compare them to their century-old rivals, Fine Gael, well, expert surveys continually struggle to find deep, defining policy differences. For political outsiders, parsing out the ideological gap between the two is a bit like finding a needle in a haystack. Broadly speaking, Fianna Fáil has traditionally leaned slightly more populist and slightly more economically interventionist, whereas Fine Gael has historically marketed itself as the party of fiscal prudence and law and order. But ultimately, Fianna Fáil's deep ideological flexibility, its ability to literally shape-shift depending on the mood of the electorate, was its absolute superpower for the better part of a century. Part 3. The historic 2011 collapse. the post-2008 economic crash, and its political toll. Because, as we'll see, a party that tries to be everything to everyone can eventually hit a breaking point when a massive crisis strikes. So 2008 happens, and the global financial crisis hit Ireland exceptionally hard. The collapse of the domestic property bubble forced the state into a humiliating international bailout from the IMF and the European Union, and it just shattered Fianna Fáil's base. And this economic trauma was compounded by the fallout from the Mahon Tribunal. This was a massive anti-corruption inquiry that revealed a culture of inappropriate financial entanglements between prominent property developers and politicians, most notably involving former leader Bertie Ahern. Held directly responsible for the severe crisis and the harsh austerity measures under Brian Cowen's leadership, the public turned on the government with visceral anger. By 2009, national satisfaction with the ruling party plummeted to a catastrophic 10%. The sheer scale of the wipeout that followed was breathtaking. 58 seats gone. In the 2011 general election, Fianna Fáil dropped from 78 representatives down to just 20. For a party that had practically defined the Irish state since its infancy, this was way more than a loss. It was total political decimation. Voters from every single demographic, young, old, urban, world, abandoned the party in droves, punishing them at the ballot box in a way that permanently altered the landscape of Irish politics. This was literally the worst defeat of a sitting government in the history of the Irish state. Overnight, they sank from being the undisputed largest party in the Dáil to a distant third largest. It snapped an incredible 79 consecutive years of being the largest single party in Parliament. Political analysts at the time described the sudden collapse of this natural governing party as simply unthinkable. And here's why this is so crucial to understand. It's a stark reminder to any political observer globally that when a catch-all party is at the helm during a generational crisis, well, they catch all of the blame. That broad coalition of voters they relied upon just evaporated overnight. Which brings us to part 4, rebuilding and historic coalitions. Unprecedented alliances to return to power. Because in politics, survival always requires adaptation. So, from the ashes of 2011, under new leader Michelle Martin, the party began a very slow, deeply pragmatic resurrection. They basically crawled back to relevance by doing whatever it took. Step 1. In 2016, they entered a confidence and supply agreement. Essentially, this meant agreeing to vote with and prop up a minority government led by their rivals, Fine Gael, without actually joining the cabinet themselves. It was a tentative step back toward influence. Step 2, by 2020, they went all in, forming a historic three-way coalition government with Fine Gael and the Green Party. And believe it or not, this patient strategy worked. Step 3, by the 2024 general election, they had managed to return to the top, once again becoming the largest party in the Dáil. But to govern again, they had to cross a line they swore they never would. To end a massive political stalemate following that 2020 election, Fianna Fáil entered a formal coalition with Fine Gael. They fundamentally shattered a century of fierce historical rivalry that traced its roots all the way back to opposite sides of the Irish Civil War in the 1920s. To make it work, they agreed to share the highest office in the land by literally rotating the roles of Taoiseach and Tánaiste, the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, between the two party leaders halfway through the government's term. It was a massive, pragmatic compromise that definitively closed a huge chapter in Irish history. All right, final section, part 5, Northern Ireland and Europe. Expanding borders and navigating European liberalism. Let's look outside the Republic to see how this adaptable party operates today. While traditionally and exclusively a Southern party, they eventually began expanding their footprint northwards into Northern Ireland. Though I have to say, the journey hasn't been entirely smooth. They officially registered as a political party there back in 2007. By 2019, they tried to make a real impact by announcing a formal, highly publicized partnership with the SDLP, which is a moderate, prominent Northern nationalist party. But the realities of cross-border organizing proved way more complicated than expected. By 2022, the SDLP ended the partnership entirely, publicly stating that they needed to stand on their own 2 feet. So that left Fianna Fáil's northern ambitions in a somewhat ambiguous holding pattern. Over on the European stage, things are just as complex. In the European Parliament, they sit with the liberal, centrist Renew Europe group.
but their culturally conservative rural roots frequently cause friction with their European colleagues. For example, they face significant international backlash for failing to vote alongside other EU liberals regarding press freedom in Italy. Plus, despite their leadership's stated progressive alignment, their parliamentary members were deeply and publicly divided on massive domestic social issues, like the 2018 Eighth Amendment referendum on abortion rights. Navigating a very socially liberal Europe while trying to hold together a traditional broad church membership at home remains a constant, really delicate balancing act.
So, after a century of absolute dominance, a devastating collapse, and an unprecedented comeback, who exactly is Fianna Fáil today? And here's why this matters far beyond the borders of Ireland. As politics grows increasingly polarized across the globe, with voters flocking to ideological extremes, is there still room for centrist parties built entirely on ideological ambiguity? Can you still survive by trying to be everything to everyone? Or will the warriors of destiny have to finally pick a definitive side to secure their future? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep exploring the nuances of the political history around you.